Thousands of participants from all across the United States are gathering in Washington this week for what is being billed as three of the most important days affecting Israel's future. But is the pro-Israel movement having a negative impact on U.S. foreign policy? I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. The pro-Israel lobby in the United States is comprised of numerous institutions and powerful individuals with various agendas. Although these groups differ in political orientation and areas of focus, they share one mandate: advocating for legislation and support from American lawmakers to benefit Israel.
The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, is considered the most influential pro-Israel lobby in the United States. Fortune magazine routinely rates it as the second most powerful lobby in the U.S., and that's counting all lobbies. More than 13,000 delegates attended its annual gathering in Washington, D.C. last year, a conference featuring keynote speeches from both U.S. President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. With a staff of 275, AIPAC isn't that big, but it's also supported by more than 100,000 grassroots members across the political spectrum. As you might suspect, it's got deep pockets. The organization has an annual budget of $60 million and an endowment of $135 million, money used to support pro-Israel initiatives in the United States. Since 2000, AIPAC has spent more than $5 million on sending American lawmakers to Israel 575 times. In the last 15 years, AIPAC has spent more than $20 million on its lobbying efforts on Capitol Hill. And AIPAC's website claims that the organization holds more than 2,000 meetings with members of Congress each year, and that their efforts help pass more than 100 pro-Israel legislative initiatives by American lawmakers every year.
This year's AIPAC conference will take place in Washington, D.C. from March 3rd to the 5th, and organizers say it will be the largest gathering of the pro-Israel movement to date. Joining me now to discuss the impact of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States is John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He's also the co-author with Stephen Walt, the controversial book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Professor, thanks so much for joining us here on The Heat. What type of impact does this lobby have here in the United States, would you say?
This lobby has a huge impact on U.S. foreign policy, especially as it applies to the Middle East. I think it's fair to say that in the United States of America, interest groups wield significant influence in the policy process. And among all the interest groups that we have in the United States, probably the Israel lobby is the most powerful interest group. And it has fundamentally affected our policy towards the Middle East for decades now.
Let me ask you this. A lot of people get confused. They think that this is just an umbrella of Americans of Jewish descent. And that's not right, is it?
No, that's wrong. There's no question that there are huge numbers of American Jews who are in the lobby. But the fact is that there are also huge numbers of American Jews who are not in the lobby, who feel no special affinity towards Israel. And at the same time, there are quite a few non-Jews in the Israel lobby. And this includes Christian Zionists and some neoconservatives who have a deep allegiance to Israel and push very hard to make sure that U.S. Middle East policy is pro-Israel. So it makes good sense not to call it a Jewish lobby, but instead to call it the Israel lobby.
Professor, I went through some of the stuff that you've written. I just want to kind of go through a little bit of it just as background. You say one American participant at Camp David in 2000 said this. He said this: far too often we functioned as Israel's lawyer. And then also you cite that former U.S. Senator Ernest Halling said when he left office, you can't have an Israeli policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here, citing, of course, Congress. And you write that Congress, as far as Congress is concerned, Israel is immune from criticism. So there is criticism of this pro-Israel lobby that they're pushing initiatives in many respects that actually are counter to U.S. interest. And I think that's kind of what you point out in your book. Can you kind of amplify on that, if you will?
Well, the fact is that Israel's strongest supporters believe that the United States should support Israel no matter what. That's the essence of the special relationship. The essence of America's special relationship with Israel is that no matter what Israel does, the United States should back Israel. But the problem with that argument is that no two countries always have the same interests. And there are going to be lots of cases where Israel's interests and the United States' interests are different. But what the lobby does is push the United States to pursue interests that favor Israel over the United States. And this is obviously not in the United States' national interest. What should be the case is that when Israel's interests and America's interests come into conflict, everybody in the U.S. Congress, and in the lobby for that matter, should back the United States, not Israel. But that, of course, is not what happened.
Well, let me get you to cite some examples where there should be divergent philosophies and there are not.
Well, just take the subject of the settlements in the West Bank. It has been American policy since 1967. It has been the policy of every American president to oppose the building of settlements in the occupied territories. Nevertheless, Israel believes it's in its interest to build settlements and has built settlements since 1967 and continues to build them. Yet the United States cannot put any pressure on Israel to stop building those settlements, even though American presidents think it's in America's interest to stop that settlement building. And the reason they can't stop Israel is because the lobby makes it politically impossible for any president to do that. And by the way, you saw that very clearly with Barack Obama in his first term as president. He went toe-to-toe with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu 4 times on this subject of settlements, and every time Netanyahu won against Obama. Now, how is it that a Prime Minister of Israel can beat the President of the United States 4 out of 4 times? There's only one answer: the Israel lobby.
Let me ask you this, because I want to at least cover this and give you a chance to respond to it, because I know after this show airs, we're going to hear from people, and they're going to say, well, you know, you didn't press him on the fact that he's got shoddy scholarship. I mean, you've heard all this stuff, that, you know, there's anti-Semitic beliefs going on here. You've been charged with all this stuff. I want to give you a chance to respond to it, because that's another thing that happens. They tend to circle their wagons, don't they, and attack people who are critical of this lobby.
When I was a little boy, my mother taught me that when people cannot beat you with facts and logic, what they do is they engage in name-calling. And anybody who criticizes Israel usually has a very good case for their criticism. And I think that's certainly true of me and Steve Walt. We're not fundamentally hostile to Israel. We just disagree with Israeli policy on many occasions, and we think it's not in the American national interest. So we have criticized Israel. Because we cannot be beaten with facts and logic, what people in the lobby do is attempt to smear us and marginalize us in the American political process. And they smear people like us, and many others as well, by calling them anti-Semites and saying that they're deeply hostile to Israel, and so forth and so on. So the name of the game here is really all about name-calling. And the sad truth is that we've gotten used to it, because since we wrote the original article in the London Review of Books, we've been called lots of names by the lobby and their allies.
Well, let me ask you about this. President Obama and all the major Republican candidates in 2012, the presidential election, spoke at the APEC summit. Is it a must for American presidential candidates, for politicians, to at least make that appearance? I know this year President Obama is skipping it. What should we read into that?
Well, I think that President Obama is skipping it because he doesn't have to run for re-election again. If this was his first term, he'd probably be there. There's no question that virtually every American politician inside the Beltway, on Capitol Hill or in the executive branch, feels compelled when asked to appear before the APEC conference and pledge allegiance to Israel. This is just part of the warp and woof of daily life in the American political system. And by the way, it has a very corrupting influence on how we conduct our foreign policy, because we end up favoring Israel in ways that is not in the American national interest.
Professor, as you know, former Nebraska Senator Chuck Hagel just recently confirmed as defense secretary, but he ran up against a firestorm because of some of the comments he made in an interview with peace negotiator Aaron David Miller. Let's have a listen.
The Jewish lobby intimidates a lot of people up here. I've always argued against some of the dumb things they do because I don't think it's in the interest of Israel. I'm a United States senator. I'm not an Israeli senator.
You surprised that he won confirmation? Did you know that that was going to be a real tricky spot to try and get around because of his comments?
I knew that he was going to face a firestorm of criticism on Capitol Hill, and I wasn't sure that he would actually be confirmed. I'm very pleased that he is confirmed because it is a defeat for the lobby. A rare defeat for sure, but nevertheless, the lobby was unable to stop his appointment as Secretary of Defense. But I don't think anybody who's studied the lobby or watched the lobby in operation over time had any doubts that they would put their gun sights on Hagel and go to enormous lengths to prevent him from becoming Secretary of Defense.
I have friends who've been in the Middle East, spent some time in the Middle East, and the comment that he made, I am not an Israeli senator, I'm a United States senator, is interesting, and I'd like you to dissect that, because my friends who are in the Middle East say that it's probably easier to be critical of Israel and its policies if you are an Israeli senator. I mean, if you were in the Knesset versus being in Congress.
Well, first of all, it's quite remarkable that anyone would be criticized for saying that I'm an American senator, not an Israeli senator. That should be a given, and there should be absolutely no criticism of Hagel or anyone else for making that comment. Again, it just shows you how distorted the discourse is in the United States, that Hagel was criticized for saying that. But with regard to Israel itself, I've been to Israel. In fact, Steve Walt and I went to Israel to talk about the lobby book. Fact is, you can have a much more open discourse about Israeli policy, about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, and about the Israel lobby inside Israel than you can in the United States. It's actually refreshing to go to Israel and talk about these things compared to trying to talk about them in the United States, where you invariably end up getting smeared for making any comments that seem like they're critical of Israel.
Professor Mearsheimer, thank you so much for joining us from Chicago. Certainly appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Is the pro-Israel lobby in the United States working against the peace process? We'll ask our panel in just a moment. The pro-Israel lobby in the United States takes credit for pushing for passage of hundreds of bills in the U.S. Congress that benefit Israel. The lobby also makes sure that Israel receives $3 billion in direct aid from the United States each year. That's roughly 1/5 of America's total foreign aid budget. But as CCTV's Stephanie Freed found out, there are mixed feelings about the efforts made by the biggest lobby, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee in Israel, the country it's trying to help.
AIPAC's mission statement declares that the organization's purpose is lobbying U.S. Congress on Israel-related issues. That translates into lots of back and forth and close ties between organization leaders, Israeli government figures, and members of Congress. When AIPAC affiliates come to town, they get the royal treatment. Helicopter tours, VIP excursions to holy sites, and FaceTime with Israel's top defense and political figures.
They are working within the political sphere, within the parliamentary sphere, Congress and Israeli Knesset, okay? They bring people together. They allow people to meet each other from both political worlds.
Current on AIPAC's agenda is pressure for the U.S. government to brand Lebanon-based Hezbollah a terrorist organization. The Iranian-backed group's ample arsenal includes rocket-loaded launchers trained on Israel. AIPAC is also working to curb Iranian nuclear development and ensure continued multi-billion-dollar security funding for the Jewish state. But what's notably missing on the agenda is any drive to push Israel and Palestinian leaders to the peace negotiations table.
You can win all the wars, but there is the only war Israel has to win is the war of peace. And they failed so far. Why? Because one of the reasons is AIPAC. Because it's an intimidator of most voters in the United States.
Peace talks between the two sides have been stalled for years, and current speculation is that if they don't get going again soon, an uprising on the streets of Palestine may result.
Congress doesn't know enough of what's going on here, and they do whatever. Israel's very powerful and it gets its way, which is fine, but it's not necessarily in Israel's long-term interest.
That isn't restricted to the relationship with the Palestinians. Critics predict that if Prime Minister Netanyahu strikes Iran, as he has threatened to do, retribution will be irrevocable. All the support, funding, preparation, and joint military cooperation in the world won't save Israeli civilians from the potential fallout.
Good friendship means to say difficult things and not always to be supportive. And in that sense, AIPAC sometimes is hugging a bear hug, the Israeli society. I know they probably have good intentions, but in many cases, their work harms the state of Israel more than it does good.
Despite criticism of the 100,000-member-strong American organization, most Israelis familiar with AIPAC appreciate their work.
There are people who think they're doing a good job and others that think that they're doing a bad job. That's normal. I mean, you wouldn't expect anything else from someone so deeply involved in politics. These are the normal reactions.
The annual policy conference, pegged as the 3 most important days of the year affecting Israel's future, will be minus Israel's Prime Minister and President Obama. And that's the first time that has happened at an annual conference in 7 years. But that's not stopping AIPAC leaders from pushing for their agendas, which include pressuring the U.S. government into giving Israel the green light on an Iran strike. Stephanie Fried, CCTV, Tel Aviv.
So has the pro-Israel lobby worked against the best interests of Israel and the Palestinians in the peace process? Joining me now to offer their takes are Roberta Seid, Education and Research Director of Stand With Us, a nonprofit organization that aims to educate people around the world on issues related to Israel, and Hussein Ibish, Senior Fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine. Hussein, Roberta, welcome to The Heat. Let me start with the most obvious question. Pro-Israel lobby, has it prevented a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine, would you say? Roberta, why don't I start with you?
Okay, absolutely not. In fact, the quote pro-Israel lobby is really a reflection of the fact that there is tremendous grassroots support for Israel across America. And the AIPAC, which is one organization, simply tries to translate that interest and support for Israel into American policy. Now, the lobby itself doesn't take a position on settlements or one or two state solution. What it does is try to ensure the friendship between America and the United States. In fact, the Israeli governments have supported a two-state solution. The main stumbling block has been that the Palestinians have refused to return to the negotiating table. This despite the $7 billion that the United States has given to the Palestinian Authority since 1993.
Let me give Hussein a chance to jump in here.
Yeah.
She's describing something rather benign. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a very complex phenomenon. I mean, what I would certainly agree with is the idea that I might even want to pluralize it, the pro-Israel lobbies. Or there's a sort of a set of constituencies that are pro-Israel to a greater or lesser extent. And I think some of them play a constructive role. There's certainly those who are pro-Israel, pro-peace. Now, in the center, of course, are the mainstream Jewish groups, the AIPAC, the ADL, and the American Jewish Committee. And I think there you find a very complex phenomenon that does reflect a kind of an interest in promoting U.S. national interests, which have to do with a two-state solution, but that also tries to protect the interests of the Israeli government. And it tends to follow, and self-consciously follow, the lead of the Israeli government. So insofar as the Israeli government is taking a constructive set of approaches, they've supported that. And when the Israeli government has done things that are not so constructive, they are it is unusual to find those groups being critical of those aspects of Israeli policy that don't help us get to where we need to go. So I think across the board, the reality is really very complex.
Well, Roberta, let me ask you this. Do you think they have too much influence on U.S. foreign policy?
No, I don't. I think what you find, as I said before, there's a tremendous broad base. Hussein sort of broke them up into different fragments. but in general there is a broad base of support for Americans, among Christian groups, among everyday Americans across the board. And that is reflected in U.S. policy. The reason American foreign policy is supportive of Israel is that Israel is its staunchest ally, and after 1967, America realized that Israel could also be a geostrategic partner, and that is the key.
Well,
look at what's happening in the Middle East today.
Well, can I just respond to that for a second?
Well, let me just finish my point.
Sure.
Look what you have happening in the Middle East today. You have enormous instability. What is the one country that America can rely on as a base? It's sort of like as a base and as an ally who will share its interests and who shares its values. It's only Israel.
Okay, let me give it to
Of course, the major American military base in the Middle East is not in Israel at all. It's in Qatar.
America, I mean, Israel
well, wait, I
is.
listen to you. I think you need to listen to me now, just as a matter of fairness. Now, what I wanted to get at is the notion that U.S. U.S. policy towards Israel is simply a reflection of the national interest as arrived at by a kind of a dispassionate process, and that's not accurate. That's not how the country is set up. The country is set up to be lobbied. It was designed to be lobbied. It was designed to respond to the levers of power that the public and interest groups can bring to bear: votes, money, advocacy, and other similar levers. So there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing illegitimate about it. But what it means is that our foreign policy sometimes does get refracted through a political lens that gives it a tinge that means that there is a certain separation between declared policy and the politics that are behind the pursuit of that policy. I mean, you could look at the sort of continued embargo against Cuba as an example where a hyper-empowered, very tiny group has been able to maintain a policy that doesn't make sense and that most people don't agree with because they're the only ones who take action on it. Let me simply say on this issue that there's nothing illegitimate about what the pro-Israel groups do to organize politically. Part of the problem is that there's so little on the other side.
Well, let me ask you about
really
that.
I wanted to interject here.
Sure.
You, in describing American foreign policy towards the Middle East as being modeled primarily or molded primarily by the quote Israel lobby, pro-Israel groups in the United States.
I didn't say that.
You're forgetting about the Saudi lobby. You're forgetting about the oil lobby.
I didn't say that.
You're forgetting about the Arabists in the State Department.
There are no. A lot of that is mythological. I mean, the Saudis lobby for themselves. They lobby for contracts. They don't lobby on questions regarding Israel. As far as I know, they don't do that. This Arabists is a very huge myth. So let's come back to the real world. In the real world, politics are important, and I don't think you should be afraid of the fact that pro-Israel constituencies are politically powerful, and that matters. You should not be scared of that fact.
Excuse me. I'm not afraid of that fact. I'm proud of it. The pro-Israel community, the Jewish community in the United States, has done remarkably well. They have contributed not only to the APAC, but to museums, to hospitals, to all kinds of things. They're very civic-minded, very philanthropic. But on the other hand, I would also insist that you consider the influence of the Arab oil-rich nations and their impact on foreign policy.
Israel, it's almost none at all.
It's not. That's simply
name one policy towards Israel that Saudi Arabia has influenced. One U.S. policy towards Israel that Saudi Arabia. Be serious.
What about selling arms, top quality arms, to Arab countries when Israel did not want them to.
Well, you mean the AWACS thing in 1980? That was not U.S. policy towards Israel. But that is not U.S. policy. That is not U.S. policy towards Israel. That is U.S. policy to its Arab allies, and that's a completely different matter. Those states are not in belligerent relationship with Israel, and you're being a little silly.
Let me hold on for just a second, Roberta. I've got to ask. Hold on for just a second. I want to ask one question. I got to get this in before we end the broadcast. President Obama is scheduled to visit Israel this month. This will be his first official visit to Israel since becoming president. Do you think that there is any way he can actually bring about pushing some progress when it comes to the Palestinian issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, bringing these sides back to the bargaining table? Roberta, let me start with you. And let's make it brief, okay?
Yeah, I think if he can convince Palestinians to return to the negotiating table, he will have made great progress. I think his main concern is less Israeli-Palestinian relationships than Iran, and I think that's going to be the priority topic.
Well, that's probably true that Iran will be a major topic. I think there's a question of laying the groundwork. And I think there really needs to be a repair in the relationship between Washington and Ramallah, the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, and a refunding of the PA. One of the things that the president should do is strongly pressure the Israeli government to release Palestinian tax revenues. That's 60% of the PA's budget. They cannot maintain law and order. No, don't interrupt me. They cannot.
Israel just released it.
No, they have not. They released 100 million. No. They released only 100 million. There is no regular transfer of that money at all, and most of it is not going to the PA. You should read the news a little bit more carefully. A one-time, once only $100 million transfer is a drop in the bucket. We're talking about what the PA needs to pay its security forces to maintain law and order in the West Bank, which we saw teetering on the brink. This is in Israel's interests, and I think the president needs to ensure that that happens.
Roberta, let me give you another chance to respond.
The Palestinians totally abrogated all PLO Israel agreements by going to the United Nations.
That doesn't abrogate any agreement, and Israel has released the money once. It doesn't abrogate any. There is nothing. People can Google. Look, people can Google the Oslo Accords and reason. There's nothing about Israel doesn't get to operate diplomatically.
Let Roberta finish.
That's not true. It was a unilateral measure.
Are you saying the Palestinians can't have a diplomacy anymore? What are you talking about?
No, I said that they went to the United Nations to ask it to declare Palestinian statehood, which is a violation of the Oslo Accords.
They asked for membership in the United
Nations. Let me backtrack here for a minute, because I think we can end on a much more positive note. I know both you and I would support a two-state solution. We hope very much that some kind of resolution can occur. The role that the United States can play has been, the United States has tried for decades to arrange some kind of rapprochement and try to develop a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think we both agree with that.
Yeah.
And we certainly hope that whatever Obama can or can't do when he is in Israel, that he will help in some way. From my perspective, the main obstacle has been Palestinians' refusal to return, and you feel differently about that.
Right. I think everyone can. I think there's blame to go. I think there's blame to be shared by everybody, not just the Palestinians, as you. And I think it's very important that the president is not only going to Israel but also going to Ramallah. That's a very important signal. And I would simply end by urging viewers to Google and read the Oslo Accords and see if this is right, and Google about the money and find out who's accurate on these.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask both of you. I've got to say goodbye. It's been a great discussion. Thank you both for joining us here on The Heat. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on Twitter. You can tweet us your questions and your comments at ccTV_The Heat. Once again, that's at ccTV_The Heat. And if you missed any of our show or to catch any of our programming online, you can log on to ccTV-America.com. And remember, when the weekend rolls around again, don't forget to turn on The Heat. Until then, I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time.
No, that's wrong. There's no question that there are huge numbers of American Jews who are in the lobby. But the fact is that there are also huge numbers of American Jews who are not in the lobby, who feel no special affinity towards Israel. And at the same time, there are quite a few non-Jews in the Israel lobby. And this includes Christian Zionists and some neoconservatives who have a deep allegiance to Israel and push very hard to make sure that U.S. Middle East policy is pro-Israel. So it makes good sense not to call it a Jewish lobby, but instead to call it the Israel lobby.
Professor, I went through some of the stuff that you've written. I just want to kind of go through a little bit of it just as background. You say one American participant
and an endowment of $135 million, money used to support pro-Israel initiatives in the United States. Since 2000, AIPAC has spent more than $5 million on sending American lawmakers to Israel 575 times. In the last 15 years, AIPAC has spent more than $20 million on its lobbying efforts on Capitol Hill. And AIPAC's website claims that the organization holds more than 2,000 meetings with members of Congress each year, and that their efforts help pass more than 100 pro-Israel legislative initiatives by American lawmakers every year.
This year's AIPAC conference will take place in Washington, D.C. from March 3rd to the 5th, and organizers say it will be the largest gathering of the pro-Israel movement to date. Joining me now to discuss the impact of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States is John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University in Political Orientation and Areas of Focus. They share one mandate, advocating for legislation and support from American lawmakers to benefit Israel.
The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, is considered the most influential pro-Israel lobby in the United States. Fortune magazine routinely rates it as the second most powerful lobby in the U.S., and that's counting all lobbies. More than 13,000 delegates attended its annual gathering in Washington, D.C. last year, a conference featuring keynote speeches from both U.S. President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. With a staff of 275, AIPAC isn't that big, but it's also supported by more than 100,000 grassroots members across the political spectrum. As you might suspect, it's got deep pockets. The organization has an annual budget of $60 million.
Thousands of participants from all across the United States are gathering in Washington this week for what is being billed as 3 of the most important days affecting Israel's future. But is the pro-Israel movement having a negative impact on U.S. foreign policy? I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. The pro-Israel lobby in the United States is comprised of numerous institutions and powerful individuals with various agendas. Although these groups differ in Chicago, he's also the co-author with Stephen Walt, the controversial book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Professor, thanks so much for joining us here on The Heat. What type of impact does this lobby have here in the United States, would you say?
This lobby has a huge impact on U.S. foreign policy, especially as it applies to the Middle East. I think it's fair to say that in the United States of America, interest groups wield significant influence in the policy process. And among all the interest groups that we have in the United States, probably the Israel lobby is the most powerful interest group. And it has fundamentally affected our policy towards the Middle East for decades now.
Let me ask you this. A lot of people get confused. They think that this is just an umbrella of Americans of Jewish descent, and that's not right, is it?